Hello, I'm Walter Edgar. I live in Cottage 1010, and this is going to be the first of a series of lectures or really conversations I'm going to have with you about South Carolina history. Now, why should we study history at all? As a retired history professor, I can tell you many freshmen used to ask that question. Well, Daniel Webster, who was a pretty wise man, said, "It is wise for us to recur to the history of our ancestors. Those who do not look upon themselves as a link connecting with the past, connecting the past with the future, do not perform their duty to the world." And a Polish scholar, right after the freedom that Poland got following the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, he said, "We learn history not in order to know how to behave or how to succeed, but to know who we are." And a little bit closer to home, two South Carolinians said, and this was during the WPA Guide to the Palmetto State, "South Carolinians are among the rare folk in the South who have no secret envy of Virginians." And from Kelly Miller, an expatriate living in Washington, "The little triangle on the map known as South Carolina represents a portion of our country whose influence has been incalculable. And the stormy petrel of the there's not a dull period in her history." And folks, that is absolutely true. Today we're going to start off with the land and the landscape, something we kind of all take for granted. What was it like 3 centuries ago, almost 3.5 centuries ago? The soil, the natural features, the climate. What prospective settlers thought was here was important, and they really thought that this was something like a Garden of Eden, a land of milk and honey, because land was the primary and in some cases the sole motive and reason for immigration to Carolina. Now, other sections of the other colonies, it was different. In Virginia, it was trade and empire. In Massachusetts, Maryland, Rhode Island, these were all religious havens. But land, the desire for cheap, available land, appears time and time again in the letters and correspondence of the first families of South Carolina. So therefore, we need to look at the image of Carolina in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, why would they think it was a Garden of Eden? Well, in all of Europe, there are only 12 species of trees. In South Carolina, there are literally dozens in our little state alone. Now, English were familiar with cypress, and oaks, and hollies, and walnuts, but they were not familiar with the size, the dimension. Think of the huge longleaf pines. We've got some of those still here on the Stillhopes property. Awe-inspiring. You read their accounts, and they just can't believe what they're seeing. The climate was viewed as healthful, but somewhat tropical. They would find out later that was not always the case. And wild game was plentiful. Now, by the mid-18th century, we're getting towards the Revolution. Things had changed, but not much. The soils were still touted as fertile. I mean, after all, this was an agricultural boom. In the Low Country, it was rice and indigo. Indigo actually was coming into the back country, and of course later in the 18th century would be cotton. And even our post-revolutionary descriptions of South Carolina talk about the boundless forest. And as we know now, the only remnant of those boundless forests are within driving distance of here, the Bibler Forest. The views on the climate, though, had changed considerably. In 1761, Governor Glenn had reported, "Our climate is various and uncertain to such an extraordinary degree that I fear not to affirm there are no people upon earth who I think suffer greater extremes of heat and cold. It is happy for us that they are not of long duration." We're recording this in late March. 2 days ago it was in the 50s. Today it's going to be 86 degrees. So what Governor Glenn said in 1761 seems to hold true today. In the summer, highs of 98 and 100 were recorded back in the 18th century. We're doing a lot of that now. And lows of 10 degrees even in the 18th century. But what we would not believe what they were saying just on the eve of the revolution. The air is more clear and pure here than in Great Britain, seldom darkened by fogs. Anybody who's been to the Low Country, or even here in the Columbia area, there are days we wake up and you think you're back in London somewhere. Game was still plentiful, but getting scarce. Bison had disappeared from the upcountry. People don't realize we had buffalo here in the 18th century. They were the beginning of the Indian paths. The Indians used the paths the bison had created in the backcountry. But land and climate affected commercial and settlement patterns. Now, that's what people thought of as the land of milk and honey, but what's the reality? A map that's going to show the South Carolina grant in 1665. That territory included all or portions of 10 of the 11 states of the Confederacy, excepting Virginia, all or portions of 15 states and northern Mexico and Baja California, and the current cities that are in that area: Raleigh, Charlotte, Nashville, Memphis, Little Rock, Oklahoma City, Houston, Dallas, El Paso, Santa Fe, Tucson, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, San Diego, New Orleans, Mobile, Montgomery, Birmingham, Baton Rouge, Jackson, Natchez, Pensacola, Jacksonville, Savannah, and Atlanta. And folks, the capital of that great province was to be Charlestown in what's now South Carolina. But how do we get from that huge grant to our little triangle on the map? Well, there was only one province of Carolina. Folks, north of the border with the capital in Raleigh don't really appreciate this, but their own state records show this. By the end of the 17th century, the first generation of settlement, the governor in Charlestown was appointing someone to be a deputy in the northeastern portion of the province. That would become North Carolina. And by 1712, there definitely were two colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina. So you've got our northern boundary begins to take shape. We're no longer going up to Virginia. And then Georgia is created as a colony in 1732, which lops off a portion of our claim. Although South Carolina continued up until the Revolution to claim land below Georgia's official boundary, which was the Altamaha River, all the way down to Florida. And we actually gave land grants there, caused some problems, but South Carolina considered it territory. And in 1787, we settled the Georgia temporarily. Settled pretty much before the Revolution. In the 21st century, the formal boundary between North and South Carolina has been rerun. And you may remember North Carolina, the kitchen was in South Carolina, which caused some difficulties because in North Carolina, where the head of the household sleeps, that's the official residence. So things had to be grandfathered in literally to affect that northern boundary. And in a famous lawsuit in the 20th century, South Carolina won claim to islands in the Savannah River at the U.S. Supreme Court that Georgia had been trying to take. 31,000 square miles. That's where we are today. The chief physical feature is the fall line or the fall zone, which roughly bisects the state from Aiken, south of Columbia, over to Sherrill. three main river systems, the Pd of the northeast, with tributaries, the Little Pd, the Lynches, the Santee River in the central portion of the state, which is the largest, formed by the conflux of the Congaree and the Wateree. And the Congaree in turn is formed by the Broad and the Saluda. And then the Savannah River in the southwest, which is joined by the Chattooga, the Tougaloo, and the Seneca. The Edisto River is a completely independent river. Now, the one thing that our early settlers were a little bit concerned about is that, particularly once you got a little bit back from the coast and the tidal flow, our rivers were black. The water was black, and that had to do with the tannic acid that came from roots and vegetation along riverbanks. But otherwise, the rivers were clear. And you'll see that strange contradiction. The water is clear but black. Looks like deep tea. Now, let's look at some of the individual sections of our state. And we've got a map here that's going to show you the different areas. And the geographers have created these, but they pretty well are understandable. And we'll start from the Atlantic. Rather than going from the mountains to the sea, let's go from the sea to the mountains. The coastal zone, then the coastal plain, an inner plain and an outer plain. The Sandhills, where we are pretty much now. And if you don't know, if you've done any digging, those of us who have a little garden plot will tell you, yes, there's a lot of sand in this area, in addition to the clay. The Piedmont and the Blue Ridge. And so let's look at these areas in some detail, because all of this affected settlement patterns, farming, and so forth. The coastline's about 185 miles long, and the coastal zone extends about 10 miles inland. And in the terms of the South Atlantic coast, it's something of a transition from the North Carolina line to the Sea Islands of Georgia. The Grand Strand stretches 60 miles, that's about a third of our coastline, from North Carolina to Winyah Bay. The Santee Delta is the largest river complex on the east coast. It's 20 miles across. And then you have the Sea Island complex that runs about 100 miles to the Savannah River. Now, everybody thinks a sea island's a sea island. Well, that's not quite the case. There are two types of sea islands. One are erosion remnant islands, and that is they were part of the mainland at one point and then they got cut off. St. Helena Island near Beaufort is a good example of that. And they're generally static, although they do have a little bit of erosion. Other islands, Hunting, Fripp, Bull, are barrier or beach ridge islands that are constantly dynamic and changing. Generally, northern ends erode, southern ends build up. Anybody who's had a house on the coast knows that. Many people prefer the southern end of the island. Now, there's several theories about how these beach islands, beach ridge islands came about. The old theory is they were formed from sandbars and gradually built up. The new theory has to do with the geologists getting into the picture, and that was the decline in the sea level during the Pleistocene epoch. The ocean retreated and it created dunes that rose up on the new coastline. When the ocean returned, it inundated the coast, but tips of the largest dunes remained, and these became the barrier islands that we know and love on our coast. Now, except along the Grand Strand, vegetation, there's not a sharp break between land and water, inlets and marshes. Fresh marshes dominated by rushes contain trees or bushes. Beach ridges, the growth is sometimes referred to as a maritime forest. Trees, shrubs are dominant, and it can be thick and they're kind of woody. Old beach ridges have live oak, sable palmetto, slash pine, wax myrtle, wild oak, and of course, Spanish moss. And the salt grasses, the corn grasses, and black rushes cover most of our tidal marshes. And then sea oats, march elder, and sand spurs. And behind the dunes protected from salt spray are wax myrtle, dwarf. The coastal zones is a dynamic merger of land and water, and it's characterized by wide beaches, barrier islands, and marshes. It's a diverse region with distinctive vegetation and major ecological value. And also it's the landform region that has been under the most pressure from human development and the reordering of the natural landscape. All you got to do is read the posting courier every discussion of development versus conservation. The coastal plain is the largest landform region in the state, about 2/3 of the state's total area. It extends from 120 to 150 miles from the Sandhills to the coastal zone. And it goes from being nearly flat to gently rolling hills in the lower Piedmont. The underlying rocks are made of substances of marine origin. You know, you can go to Orangeburg County and find the remnants of sand dunes, fossils, the largest shark's teeth, mastodon bone. All of those are found in used to be coast. And this period evolved over millions of years. And although the entire state is subject to seismic activity, the most severe episode recorded was the Charleston earthquake of 1886, and the epicenter was Somerville. The outer coastal plain runs from 10 miles inland to the Orangeburg Scarp, which is the old coastline. The land just gradually rises up from sea level to 200 feet in a series of most terraces. If you look at a geological map, you can literally see it's a very gentle rise. And if you're not aware of it, unless you want to go through a cut, you can't even realize it. Distinctive features include the wonderful Carolina bays, mostly found along the entire coast from Maryland to Florida, but here in the two Carolinas, and especially in Horry and Dillon counties. The intercoastal plain is rolling and hilly. We're getting towards Columbia now, and it's hard to differentiate the Sandhills from the lower Piedmont. And the elevation's about between 200 and 300 feet. Visitors, including George Washington, have for centuries complained about the endless expanse of pine forests they crossed in this part of the state. There are lots of pine trees, but the outer coastal plain has bays of all sorts: red, sweet, loblolly, ball cypress, water tupelo, and scattered along open plains, open grasslands are longleaf pines. The intercoastal plains, you have higher terrain, river bluffs, and pine and hardwood forest combination, dominated by loblolly, hickory, and various oaks. Let's look at the terrain here on our campus. You've got pine trees, you've got hardwoods. And the oaks are not always the best variety, but they are. It's a part of that pine hard, typical of the intercoastal. And you throw in sweet gum, water hickory, and cypress. I can walk out the bistro door and see a sweet gum tree. And there are cypress knees if you look hard around the pond. The coastal plain, the rivers meander through the plains. There's swamp vegetation, there are cut-off lakes. Higher lands feature longleaf and slash pines, most of which have been planted by modern foresters. The Sandhills is a narrow band of hills that runs, as I said, northeast to southwest from Chesterfield through portions of Sumter, Kershaw, Richland, Lexington, and Aiken counties. And it was a distinctive land feature formed several millions ago of sands and clays. Again, a perfect description of the land right here on the campus. And the vegetation is as unique as the area itself. A lot of it has been adapted to dry conditions. We average about 45 inches of rain here in what we'd call the Midlands. And because of the nature of the soil, that rain drains off pretty quickly. I've mentioned the pines, but we get sparkleberry, a form of goldenrod, and sand myrtle. And the longleaf pines would likely still dominate the landscape if human beings had not changed it. And then we come to the Piedmont, the foothills, a 100-mile belt between the Sandhills and the Blue Ridge. It's about a third of the state's area. And the elevation ranges from 300 feet here in the Columbia area to 1,200 feet at the Blue Ridge. The terrain ranges from gently rolling above Columbia to extremely hilly in the northwest portions of the state. If you grew up in Columbia, you know how hilly Columbia is. If you're there at the university and you go down Pickens Street and you cross Blossom Street and you go up the other side of the hill towards our old home on Hollywood Drive, particularly if you walk it, you realize how hilly Columbia truly is. Or if you come down from the Capitol to cross the river at Blossom Street or Gervais Street, it's quite as hilly on because the land is bluffs along the river. Now, it's a complex geological history, and geologists geologists estimate that this part of the state is over 1 billion years old, the rocks. And during the Precambrian period, which is about 600 million years ago, the Piedmont was a continental fragment, an island off what was then considered the proto-North American continent. And about 470 million years ago, there was a running together of the seismic plates, and that island crushed into the what was then becoming the North American continent, and that crash created the Blue Ridge Mountains. Then, 350 million years ago, another collision, and that brought the lower part of the state into the North American continent. Continental shifts and collisions resulted in a lot of heat and pressure, creating rocky soil and mountains. The river valleys are relatively wide and sloping and separated from one another by broad upland areas. And the rivers are long with lots of tributaries. They're usually discolored by heavy sediment, lots of mud. There was a wonderful story written just before World War II. Red Hills and Cotton is one of my favorite memoirs in South Carolina history. And this young man describes his great aunt explaining why, as two rivers came together, what they represented about humankind. One came straight down from the mountains through rocky soil, and so it ran clear. The other ran through lower country and brought mud, and she said, "Look at how sin pollutes." And that was his great aunt Narcissa's explanation of, "You better be a good boy." And there are singular features, monadnocks, isolated mountains of rock throughout this area. Paris Mountain, Glassy Mountain, Kings Mountain, and across the border in Georgia, Stone Mountain. Now, humans have played a major role in the vegetation we see today. It was originally mature forests of short-leaf pine and stands of hardwoods. And until the 1940s, more than 2 million acres of this Piedmont was in food crops. By the 1970s, 1.3 million of those acres had been abandoned, had been put into forests for the most part. And two plants are widespread throughout the Piedmont: loblolly pines and kudzu. The Piedmont extends from Pennsylvania to Alabama. Severe soil erosion, a lot of topsoil lost. In 1930s, most of our state in the Piedmont was among the most severely eroded areas in the United States. In fact, Fairfield County was the most seriously eroded county in the United States of America. And then we come to the Blue Ridge, sometimes the land of romance. This is James Dickey, Deliverance territory. It's only a small portion of the Appalachian Mountains and situated in the northern extremes of Oconee, Pickens, and Greenville County, only about 600 square miles. Elevations range from 1,400 to 3,500 feet, and the highest peak is Sassafras Mountain. It has the greatest relief in terms of dropping precipitously and the steepest slopes in South Carolina. Now, it's not in the same league with the Rockies, the Cascades, or the Sierra Nevadas, but then those ranges are nearly only 100 million years old, whereas the Blue Ridge is 250 million years older than the Rockies and those. So they've been eroded over time. Age, moderate temperatures, and greater precipitation have resulted in more weathering here than out west. The vegetation was originally an oak chestnut forest, and humans were not responsible for the chestnuts disappearing. The chestnut blight at the turn of the 20th century was responsible for the decimation of that. And that's been replaced almost usually by oaks, especially the chestnut oak and tulip poplars. You'll also find hemlocks, beech, yellow birch, and this is a land of flame and pink azaleas and native rhododendron. And the Blue Ridge, of course, is noted for its waterfall and its fast-flowing streams, cooler temperatures, and considerable rainfall. Now, from the sea, the mountains, and just diversity rain in this little 31,000 square mile triangle of South Carolina. Think of being a settler here almost 350 or 60 years ago and coming across the Blackwater rivers of the Santee or the Edisto, or seeing pine trees that you look at and say, well, that's big enough to be a ship's mast. And many of them would be. That's how Kingstree got its name. It was set aside as a where there were trees big enough to be taken for the Royal Navy. And the wildlife was simply amazing. Not just bison, leopards. People talk about crabs, settlers talk about along the coast, bigger than 2 foot across. I'd love to catch one of those blue craws. I'm not sure I'd want to be swimming with one, but that's what and oysters as big as your hand. But think about, we love Bull's Bay oysters. They're about this big. So with the rich variety of terrain and natural life that was here in South Carolina, you can see why it was an attraction for settlers from many different parts of the world. And settling South Carolina is going to be the topic of our next conversation.